The trouble began on an otherwise quiet Saturday morning, the kind of morning where the neighborhood usually settled into its predictable rhythm, sprinklers hissing across manicured lawns, retirees on slow walks, and the occasional car rolling down the cul-de-sac at a cautious crawl. For 3 years, the street had been peaceful for the homeowner, who had chosen this place precisely for its calmness. His dog, a large mixed-breed rescue named Atlas, had fit perfectly into that tranquility. Atlas spent his mornings sunbathing on the porch and his afternoons exploring the fenced backyard, rarely causing even a moment's disruption. That peace dissolved the moment Karen moved into the house across the street. She arrived with the energy of a storm, unyielding, dramatic, and loudly announcing itself before impact. From the day the moving truck pulled up, she scrutinized her neighbors with narrowed eyes, mentally measuring lawns for compliance, comparing mailbox heights, and documenting minor imperfections as if she'd been hired as an auditor for suburban perfection. The HOA didn't require such intensity, but she took it on like a personal mission. Atlas became her fixation almost immediately. The first complaint arrived the second week after her move. A white envelope showed up in the homeowner's mailbox, printed with the stiff, overly formal tone typical of HOA notices. It stated that multiple neighbors had expressed concerns about a dangerous and aggressive dog on the property. The words felt exaggerated, almost laughable, given that Atlas had never so much as growled at anyone. The dog preferred belly rubs and attention from Amazon drivers. Yet, the notice was real, and it was the first sign that something had shifted in the neighborhood. The homeowner dismissed it as an overreaction from someone new who didn't yet understand the community. He assumed that once Karen saw Atlas in person, calm, friendly, and usually half asleep on the porch, she would realize her assumptions were wrong. But that hope evaporated quickly. Within days, Karen positioned herself as the neighborhood watchdog, except her vigilance was singularly focused on Atlas. She filmed him through her blinds whenever he stepped outside. She marched across the street to inspect the fence line, as though hunting for violations. And she made a point of lingering near the homeowner's yard with her phone ready, waiting for any excuse to escalate her mission. Each action felt calculated, intentional, and increasingly hostile. The second notice came shortly after, citing a barking disturbance. The accusation felt surreal. Atlas rarely barked, and only when startled by something genuinely unusual. Yet Karen had recorded a 30-second video of Atlas barking at a passing raccoon in the early morning hours. She presented this clip to the HOA as evidence of ongoing disruption. They accepted it without question, adding another mark to the homeowner's record. Then came the incident that confirmed her intentions. One evening, as Atlas lay quietly on the front lawn, enjoying the breeze, Karen marched across the street with an intensity that made even the dog lift his head in confusion. She had her phone held high, recording with the dramatic flair of someone preparing for a courtroom showdown. She circled Atlas at a cautious distance, narrating the situation to her camera as if documenting a crime scene. Her behavior only confused the dog further, but he remained still, sensing no threat worth reacting to. Yet she continued her performance, speaking loudly enough for the entire street to hear. The next morning, another message arrived from the HOA. According to the complaint, Atlas had been acting aggressively toward a neighbor who feared for her safety. The accusation was absurd, but now it was clear that Karen's crusade against Atlas was deliberate and relentless. She wasn't misinformed, she was manufacturing incidents. Things escalated further when she called animal control. 2 officers arrived at the homeowner's door on a weekday afternoon, responding to a report of a dangerous, uncontrolled animal threatening residents. Atlas greeted them with excited tail wags and a shoe he'd been carrying as a toy. The officers looked at each other, clearly unimpressed with the validity of the complaint. They inspected Atlas briefly and assured the homeowner that the dog posed no threat. But they also warned that repeat calls, even frivolous ones, could become problematic if tied to HOA documentation. The constant disruption and the growing stack of baseless reports created a heavy tension in the household. The neighborhood no longer felt peaceful, it felt monitored. The homeowner became hyper-aware of every noise Atlas made, every rustle of the fence, every moment the dog stepped outside. Karen's windows remained half-covered with blinds, but her silhouette was often visible behind them, watching. The homeowner began documenting everything, Atlas's behavior, the dates of the complaints, interactions with the HOA, and encounters with animal control. It felt ridiculous to gather proof for something so obviously harmless, yet it also felt necessary. Karen's ability to twist mundane moments into violations was becoming more dangerous than the accusations themselves. The breaking point arrived when Karen escalated matters to code enforcement. One afternoon, a city vehicle parked across the street and an officer approached with a clipboard. He cited a complaint that Atlas was being kept in unsafe conditions and potentially violating municipal regulations regarding vicious animals. The implication was insulting and infuriating, but the officer was simply following procedure. He inspected the home, the yard, and Atlas himself. Once again, it was clear that the complaint lacked substance. But this time, something changed. The officer mentioned that the city had received multiple complaints in a short window, all from the same individual. The pattern was suspicious, and the homeowner's documentation supported the idea that this wasn't an honest concern but intentional harassment. That word, harassment, stuck with him. It reframed everything that had happened. It wasn't just annoyance. It was targeted, obsessive, malicious behavior disguised under the authority of HOA channels and municipal reporting systems. That night, the homeowner began researching options to protect Atlas and put an end to the escalating situation. It was then that he discovered something that could turn the tables completely: the legal protections offered to emotional support animals. Not just for the dog's benefit, but for shielding against harassment, discrimination, and wrongful accusations involving the animal's presence. The idea didn't come lightly. He thought about Atlas's role in his life, the comfort the dog provided during stressful days, the companionship during lonely evenings, the grounding presence during anxious moments. The dog wasn't just a pet, he truly was emotional support. The certification would be legitimate, just formalized and legally backed. The thought sparked a plan, not out of spite, but out of necessity. A way to protect Atlas, shield himself from escalating harassment, and confront Karen's behavior using the very system she had weaponized. And as the plan formed, so did something else: resolve. The balance of power in the neighborhood was about to shift. The decision to pursue an emotional support animal certification began quietly, almost tentatively, but gathered momentum as the homeowner realized just how deeply the situation with Karen had infiltrated his daily life. The stress she introduced wasn't confined to the occasional HOA notice or passive-aggressive glare from across the street. It had woven itself into routines, thoughts, and even sleep. Each time Atlas stepped outside, the homeowner anticipated the sound of a phone recording or the eventual appearance of another envelope bearing the HOA's official letterhead. The house that was once a sanctuary had become a stage, and Karen had assumed the role of relentless critic. Making Atlas a registered emotional support animal was not a retaliatory plan, it was a protective one. And it carried a sense of finality, like taking the first real step into a larger battle that had been brewing since the day Karen arrived. The homeowner spent evenings researching regulations, examining legal protections, and reading experiences from others who had turned to ESA certification when confronted with hostile neighbors or discriminatory HOAs. The more he learned, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a viable option, it was a turning point. Emotional support animals didn't require specialized training like service animals. They needed only a legitimate psychological or emotional need recognized by a licensed mental health professional. And that need existed. Atlas had become an anchor during difficult periods, a source of calm in moments when anxiety threatened to take over. Recognizing that truth brought unexpected clarity. This wasn't merely paperwork. This was validation of a bond that had already been shaping his life for years. The process began with an evaluation. The homeowner found himself recounting the stresses that had accumulated, not only from Karen's harassment but from broader life pressures, workplace instability, familial responsibilities, and the enduring toll of living under scrutiny. The professional he spoke with listened, asked questions, and ultimately confirmed what the homeowner had always known on some level: Atlas was not just emotional support. He was vital support. Within a week, the certification was complete. Holding the official documentation for Atlas brought a newfound sense of empowerment. The dense legal language, the official seals, and the confirmation of rights under housing and anti-discrimination laws created a barrier Karen could not easily penetrate. The homeowner organized the documents carefully, placing copies in folders, scanning digital versions, and preparing a neatly compiled packet to present to the HOA. Once submitted, the HOA would be legally obligated to acknowledge Atlas's status and adjust their treatment accordingly. This was no longer a situation where Karen's complaints could be accepted blindly or used to threaten consequences. The law now offered a shield, one Karen had unknowingly pushed him into acquiring. Yet the certification was only the beginning of the shift. What followed was the slow, deliberate process of reclaiming peace within the home. For the first time in months, Atlas's presence felt secure. The homeowner no longer had to worry that each bark, even a single startled yelp, would spawn another complaint. He no longer felt the same dread each time he checked the mailbox. And as he prepared to notify the HOA, he also prepared for the inevitable fallout once Karen realized her influence had run out. Before contacting the HOA, the homeowner took another step, one rooted in necessity rather than strategy. He gathered all previous complaints, every recorded instance of Karen filming Atlas, the timestamps of animal control visits, and the notes he had made after each interaction with city officials. The collection read like a diary of escalating obsession, but it also formed the backbone of what could become a formal harassment case if needed. Even the city code enforcement officer's observations, acknowledging repeated, baseless complaints, played a critical role. Everything was organized, annotated, and stored securely. No piece of the puzzle would be overlooked. The homeowner understood now that confronting Karen wasn't about matching her hostility. It was about presenting the truth clearly, confidently, and within the proper legal channels. When the notification was delivered to the HOA, it landed with the weight of a chapter closing. The homeowner submitted the official ESA documentation, referencing the protections granted under the Fair Housing Act. The packet included a summary of the harassment he'd endured and a request for the HOA to cease all dog-related enforcement actions unless supported by substantial, verified evidence. The message was polite, but firm. Measured, but authoritative. The HOA board was caught by surprise. Accustomed to relying on Karen's whirlwind of reports, they now found themselves confronted with federal protections they couldn't ignore. They acknowledged receipt of the documents and explained that they would review their existing records related to Atlas. The homeowner could almost sense their hesitation, as if they realized belatedly that they had allowed a single resident's complaints to push them into questionable territory. Meanwhile, Karen sensed that something had shifted. Whether it was the absence of tension in the homeowner's posture or the sudden quiet in the HOA's communication, she detected the change immediately. Her behavior intensified subtly. She spent more time lingering on her porch, more time watching Atlas, more time recording insignificant moments on her phone. Yet her actions felt different now. They no longer carried the same threat. They seemed frantic, like someone trying to maintain control over a situation that was slipping through her fingers. Despite her vigilance, nothing happened. The HOA issued no notices. Code enforcement did not reappear. And animal control had already dismissed her claims. Days passed. Then a week. And the silence was deafening. The absence of harassment provided room for something the homeowner hadn't felt in far too long: clarity. With Atlas's legal protection established, he began contemplating a more decisive response. The documentation he had gathered wasn't just a shield, it was potential ammunition for a future action. If Karen escalated again, he would be ready. And if the HOA had any intention of continuing the pattern of unverified complaints, they would be met with the full weight of federal law. But the story wasn't over. Far from it. Karen was not the type to accept defeat quietly. Her obsession with controlling the neighborhood ran deeper than a dislike for dogs. She thrived on the illusion of authority, on the belief that her actions shaped the community. The realization that she no longer had influence over Atlas or his owner only fueled her resentment. Late one evening, the homeowner noticed her porch light flicker on and her blinds shift slightly. She remained at her usual post, watching the street as if waiting for something, anything, to justify another attempt at control. And then it came. A new notice arrived. Not from the HOA or the city, but a personal letter taped to the homeowner's door. It bore no official markings, just familiar handwriting filled with shaky confidence and barely concealed rage. It was a sign that Karen had no intention of backing down. The letter taped to the front door marked a shift from nuisance to intrusion. Its arrival wasn't accompanied by the usual stiff formality of HOA stationery or the mechanical detachment of municipal paperwork. Instead, it felt personal, raw, unfiltered, and fueled by emotion rather than regulation. That alone made it far more unsettling. Karen had abandoned the veneer of official authority she'd hidden behind for months. Now she had stepped into the open, revealing her frustration and desperation without restraint. The homeowner removed the letter carefully, aware that even this moment might be recorded from across the street. The handwriting was unmistakable, rigid, uneven strokes carved into the page as if pressed by impatience or anger. Every line radiated the same frantic energy she had been displaying from her porch for days. The letter condemned Atlas again, questioned the legitimacy of his emotional support certification, and demanded that the homeowner take responsibility for the disruption she believed he caused. Though the words carried no legal weight, they held a psychological aggression Karen had previously disguised beneath the structure of HOA rules. The homeowner didn't respond. Silence was the most effective barrier. He archived the letter with the other records, another piece of evidence documenting her escalating behavior, and refused to let the message alter his routine. But Karen had crossed a line. Her personal involvement signaled a new phase, one no longer bound by procedures. And that made her unpredictable. Atlas sensed the tension like a shifting weather pattern. The dog remained close to the homeowner's side, moving with quiet attentiveness whenever the blinds rustled or footsteps echoed outside. Despite his gentle demeanor, he had an uncanny intuition for stress that came from years of being rescued and loved back to calm. He recognized disruptions long before the homeowner acknowledged them consciously. The days following the letter unfolded with a surreal stillness. Karen continued watching, but she no longer wielded her phone with the same vigor. Instead, she lingered with a brooding presence, an observer waiting for a spark. The HOA remained silent, reviewing the submitted documentation and re-evaluating Karen's long chain of complaints. Without her influence propelling them forward, they shifted into a more cautious posture, aware that their previous actions might be called into question. The absence of official noise, no notices, no warnings, brought a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. It was peaceful, but in the way a landscape becomes quiet before a storm. That storm arrived one humid evening when the homeowner returned from running errands. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed something odd about the fence line, subtle at first, but unmistakable the moment he approached. The latch on the backyard gate hung open. It was a latch he always checked, always secured, because Atlas roamed the yard freely and needed boundaries for safety. The gate had been tampered with. Atlas remained inside, unharmed, lounging on the grass with the innocent bliss of a dog unaware of the danger he narrowly avoided. But the sight of the open gate sent a chill down the homeowner's spine. The possibility that a stranger had entered his property was bad enough. The possibility that it had been Karen, seeking visual proof of some imagined violation, was far worse. He scanned the surroundings. Karen's blind snapped shut abruptly, as if she hadn't meant to be caught watching. Her porch light flickered on seconds later, illuminating her front walkway like a spotlight prepared for confrontation. The timing was too precise to feel coincidental. Though there was no proof she had approached the gate, the suspicion itself deepened the sense of intrusion. The homeowner documented the incident immediately, photographing the open latch, the position of the gate, and the timestamp. A quiet resolve began forming beneath the surface, solidifying into a readiness he hadn't felt before. Karen had made this personal long ago, but now the situation had physical implications, risks that went beyond letters and accusations. If Atlas had wandered into the street or encountered a vehicle, the consequences could have been tragic. The next morning, the HOA reached out. Their response, though bland on the surface, carried an undertone of caution. They acknowledged the emotional support certification and confirmed that Atlas was now under federal protection. Additionally, they revealed that they had begun reviewing the volume and nature of Karen's complaints. The phrase, pattern of behavior, appeared multiple times in their message. It was clear they were distancing themselves from her influence. But Karen wasn't willing to fade quietly into irrelevance. Her control over the narrative had slipped away, and she reacted to the shift with renewed determination. Over the next several days, she initiated a series of subtle provocations, standing close to the property line, pacing her yard at odd hours, letting her presence linger like a challenge. Her desperation radiated from every glance, every recorded moment, every exaggerated reaction. The homeowner continued documenting every unusual activity, every instance of surveillance, every confrontation, silent or otherwise, became part of a growing file. He knew now that this wasn't simply about Atlas or the HOA. It had become a case of harassment, one that the legal system would not treat lightly. The final escalation arrived unexpectedly. One afternoon, the homeowner was working in the backyard, trimming overgrown branches while Atlas rested beside him. The neighborhood was quiet, the air warm and still, when a sudden clatter echoed from the front yard. It was the distinct sound of metal striking pavement. He hurried around the side of the house and found a familiar sight, Karen standing at the base of his driveway, phone raised, her expression contorted with indignation. At the edge of the lawn, his trash bin lay toppled on its side. It was a small but calculated act, designed not for damage but for provocation. She wanted a reaction, something she could twist into another complaint, another story to fuel her crusade. The homeowner didn't give her the satisfaction. Instead, he observed the scene with calm detachment, letting her performance wither under the weight of its own absurdity. Yet the incident added another entry to the growing record, a record that now painted a clear picture of harassment, intimidation, and attempted manipulation. Each escalation served as a reminder that the situation could no longer be managed silently. It was approaching a point where legal intervention wasn't just an option, it was becoming necessary. Evening fell with a heavy stillness. The porch lights flickered on across the neighborhood. Atlas curled up on his favorite blanket, unaware of the shifting tides around him. The homeowner reviewed his documentation one last time, organizing the evidence with meticulous care. There was enough, more than enough, to take action. And he was ready. As the final pages slid into place, a quiet realization settled in. The next step would take this conflict beyond the boundaries of the cul-de-sac. Karen had pushed things far beyond neighborly disputes, and he would handle it accordingly. The turning point had arrived. Its peak. Even routine morning walks slowed near the two houses, as residents cast cautious glances, aware that tensions had reached a boiling point. The morning of the hearing arrived quietly. The homeowner left early, carrying a binder filled with neatly organized evidence, photographs, timestamps, records of every notice, printed emails from city departments, and even the personal letter Karen had taped to his door. Atlas watched him leave with a calm that seemed almost symbolic, as though the dog knew instinctively that this day held weight. The HOA meeting room was a modest space nestled inside the community recreation center. The walls were lined with pastel paintings and framed notices, an attempt to soften the formality of the setting. A long table stretched at the front where the board members sat with pens poised, expressions neutral but attentive. Folded chairs were arranged in rows, though the only occupants were the homeowner, Karen, and two board members who had volunteered to assist. Karen arrived moments after him, her posture stiff, her expression caught between indignation and disbelief. She carried a stack of loose papers clutched too tightly to be organized. The tension radiating from her felt like static in the air, unsettled, unpredictable, and ready to spark at the slightest provocation. The homeowner remained composed, his binder resting on his lap like a shield crafted with precision and intention. For the first time, he felt the balance of power shifting tangibly. No porch glances or whispered accusations could manipulate this space. Facts would determine the outcome. The board opened the meeting with formality, acknowledging the nature of the dispute and the seriousness of the allegations submitted by both parties. Karen leaned forward eagerly, as if she couldn't wait for her moment. She placed her papers on the table in a disorganized pile and took a deep breath, preparing to perform the role she had rehearsed for months. But it wasn't a performance she could control. The board requested that the homeowner present his evidence first. He opened his binder methodically. Each page turned with purpose, revealing a meticulous timeline of events that stunned the board into quiet focus. The photographs of the open gate illustrated not simply negligence but deliberate interference. The repeated timestamps of recorded harassment painted a picture of obsession, not concern. The stack of HOA notices revealed a pattern of one-sided reporting that lacked verification, and the statements from animal control and code enforcement demonstrated unequivocally that Karen's complaints held no substance. Then came the documentation proving Atlas's emotional support animal status. This revelation shifted the atmosphere sharply. The law was clear: any discrimination or targeted harassment related to a protected ESA fell under federal protection. The board members exchanged glances, aware that they had stepped dangerously close to violating those protections by previously supporting Karen's unverified claims. Karen, watching from across the table, shifted uncomfortably. Her confidence faltered. Her eyes darted to the board, then back to the homeowner's binder, as though realizing too late that the entire narrative she had crafted was unraveling in front of her. When it was her turn to speak, the shift in tone was undeniable. Karen attempted to defend her actions, but her arguments lacked the structure and clarity of the evidence she faced. Her complaints blurred together into emotional assertions, fears she couldn't substantiate, anxieties that contradicted documented facts, and a fixation on Atlas that made her appear less concerned neighbor and more personal adversary. The board listened politely, but their expressions grew increasingly neutral, then mildly concerned, then unmistakably skeptical. Her stack of papers consisted mostly of screenshots, handwritten notes, and blurry images taken at odd angles, none of which supported her claims. She grew visibly flustered as the board questioned inconsistencies, particularly the disparity between her accusations and the official reports dismissing them. The turning point arrived when the board asked her directly about the open gate incident. Karen hesitated. For a moment, the room held its breath. Her answer stumbled, shifting blame toward imagined scenarios and hypothetical dangers. But it was clear to everyone present, she had no explanation that aligned with reality. The homeowner didn't need to say anything more. The truth stood on its own. The board recessed briefly to deliberate, leaving the room steeped in quiet tension. Karen remained rigid in her seat, eyes fixed on the table, her breathing sharp and uneven. The homeowner maintained his calm, though the adrenaline simmered beneath the surface. The moment felt surreal, months of anxiety and intrusion compressed into a single room, a single hearing, a single decision. When the board returned, their conclusion was measured but firm. They acknowledged Atlas's ESA status and confirmed that he was fully protected under federal law. They recognized a clear pattern of excessive, unverified complaints lodged by Karen. They issued an official warning to her regarding harassment and misuse of HOA reporting channels. Additionally, they noted that any further incidents of false reporting or interference with the homeowner's property would result in fines and potential legal action. For the first time, Karen's authority, real or perceived, had been stripped away. The homeowner felt a quiet wave of relief wash over him. Not triumph, not victory, just a heavy weight lifting, replaced by the steady realization that the neighborhood no longer belonged to Karen's narrative. But as he left the meeting, passing Karen still frozen in disbelief, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Her silence wasn't acceptance. It was the pause before another attempt, another escalation. Because Karen was not someone who backed down easily. And she was about to prove it. The aftermath of the HOA hearing settled over the neighborhood like a cooling breeze, but beneath the calm lay a current of tension that couldn't be ignored. The board's decision had been decisive, official, and unequivocal. Karen's reign of influence over the HOA had been severed, her authority publicly challenged, and the baseless nature of her complaints exposed. For the homeowner, the ruling brought a sense of relief, an unfamiliar but welcome quiet in the rhythm of daily life. For Karen, however, the ruling ignited something volatile. In the days that followed, she retreated into her home with an intensity that suggested not defeat, but regrouping. Her blinds remained drawn, but subtle signs of activity hinted at a storm brewing beneath the silence. Packages arrived at her door, small boxes, envelopes, bulky parcels, with increasing frequency. Each delivery driver was met by a brief, clipped exchange, followed by the sound of her door slamming shut. Neighbors whispered theories, wondering what she was planning, but no one dared to ask. Meanwhile, the homeowner attempted to return to normal life. Atlas resumed his routine, The morning patrol along the fence line, the midday sunbathing on the porch, the casual wanderings to sniff familiar scents. The house felt lighter, less suffocating. Yet the homeowner remained alert. The hearing had not concluded the conflict, it had simply shifted the battlefield. The first sign of Karen's retaliation arrived quietly. Late one evening, while the neighborhood settled into its usual nighttime stillness, a faint buzzing sound drifted across the cul-de-sac. It started as a soft hum, barely noticeable, then grew louder as something mechanical approached the homeowner's property. When he stepped outside, the scene revealed an unsettling sight. A small drone hovered above the front yard, its lights flickering in methodical patterns, its camera angled directly toward the house. It fluttered like an insect desperate to land, hovering just long enough to gather footage before jerking upward and disappearing into the shadowy space above Karen's roofline. The homeowner recorded the incident, knowing instinctively who operated the drone. It wasn't simply a hobbyist experimenting with flight. It was surveillance. A new tactic from someone whose previous methods had been stripped away. The intrusion stirred something cold in his chest, not fear, but a renewed sense of violation. Even the air felt invaded. Over the next several days, the drone returned intermittently. Sometimes it hovered near the backyard, lingering just long enough to capture Atlas during his evening walks. Other times it swept along the fence line, its lens zoomed toward the corners of the yard. Each appearance felt like a silent message: Karen was not finished. The homeowner contacted the HOA again, providing videos and timestamps. This time, the board reacted swiftly, issuing a formal notice demanding an immediate cease to drone surveillance and reminding all residents that filming private backyards violated community bylaws and state privacy regulations. But the HOA's warning did little to deter Karen. If anything, it seemed to embolden her defiance. Meanwhile, the homeowner continued documenting everything. The drone footage became part of a growing archive, an undeniable ledger of harassment that now extended beyond letters and complaints. He also positioned cameras around the property, forming a protective web of digital eyes. Atlas, ever sensitive to emotional shifts, remained close by, resting his head on the homeowner's knee whenever tension infiltrated the atmosphere. One night, the situation escalated in a way no one expected. A loud crash echoed from the side of the house, jolting Atlas upright with a startled bark. The homeowner hurried outside, flashlight in hand, sweeping the beam across the yard until it landed on a large potted plant shattered across the concrete. Soil spilled in dark mounds, ceramic shards scattered like jagged teeth. The pot had been placed safely earlier that day. Now it was lying several feet from where it belonged, as if shoved or thrown. There were no witnesses, no cameras capturing the moment. But the direction of the scattered debris told a story. It had come from Karen's side of the property line. The incident marked another shift in the conflict. This was no longer about intimidation from a distance. It was tangible, physical, and invasive. The homeowner documented it carefully, but deep down he knew it was only a matter of time before Karen made another move. The neighborhood began to take notice. Residents whispered during morning walks, exchanging cautious glances toward Karen's house. Some avoided passing by altogether, as if afraid her hostility might spill outward toward anyone within reach. Her behavior, once merely disruptive, now carried an unsettling energy that rippled through the entire street. Then came the breaking point. It was a cool evening, the kind that invited neighbors outside for a stroll. The homeowner was sitting on the porch as Atlas lounged contentedly nearby, the air calm and still. For a brief moment, everything felt normal, peaceful, even. But the illusion shattered when Karen stepped out of her front door, clutching a thick folder of papers that resembled a disorganized attempt at evidence. She marched toward the center of the street with an expression twisted by frustration, determination, and something darker, something desperate. Though she said nothing, her actions spoke clearly. She opened the folder and began spreading the papers across her car's hood, sorting them frantically under the dim porch light, as though building a final case to justify her vendetta. But her hands trembled. Her movements grew erratic. She sifted through documents that contradicted each other, circled phrases, scratched out sentences, then repeated the process in chaotic loops. Whatever narrative she was trying to construct had unraveled alongside her composure. Her obsession had consumed her. As neighbors watched cautiously from behind curtains, the homeowner observed from a distance. He realized then that Karen was no longer fighting for control of the neighborhood. She was fighting to maintain a version of reality where her actions still made sense, where she could still claim authority, where she wasn't the villain of her own story. But the truth had already caught up. The next morning, the homeowner received an email, this time not from the HOA, but from a legal office representing the association. They informed him that Karen had attempted to file a formal complaint against the HOA board itself, accusing them of conspiracy. The office, in turn, had begun reviewing her actions for potential legal repercussions. They requested copies of his documentation to support the investigation. The pieces were finally aligning. Karen's desperation had pushed her into a corner she could no longer escape with dramatics or accusations. Her behavior had crossed into territory that demanded accountability, not from neighbors, not from the HOA, but from the legal system she had provoked without understanding its limits. The homeowner gathered his files once more. The next steps would be decisive. Karen had crossed every boundary imaginable. And now, for the first time, the consequences were coming for her. Neighbors who had witnessed Karen's actions submitted written statements, describing her habit of monitoring the owner's yard, approaching the dog without permission, and once even attempting to lure him closer to photograph him from an angle that made him appear threatening. A few members of the audience gasped softly when this detail was read. It had been something few people had known, but it painted a much clearer picture of what had been happening behind the scenes. When the board switched to Karen's documented actions, the tone of the room shifted again, this time carrying an unmistakable heaviness. They reviewed the footage of Karen approaching the dog without cause, the repeated complaints she filed, sometimes multiple in a single week, and the discrepancies in her statements. They revealed that code enforcement had flagged several of her reports as inconsistent and had recommended an internal review. Even the HOA president, previously swayed by Karen's assertiveness, now sat stiffly with clasped hands, unable to defend the pattern of behavior exposed. Karen was given a chance to respond. Though she did not speak in the narrative here, her demeanor told its own story. Her shoulders tensed with each mention of evidence. Her brows tightened when witnesses were mentioned. And when the topic shifted to her personal conduct, something in her facade cracked, just slightly, but enough for the room to notice. She had entered the feud believing she could push boundaries without consequence. But now those boundaries had closed around her, forming a reality she couldn't charm or intimidate her way out of. The board went into private deliberation, though it wasn't needed. Everyone in the room could sense what the outcome would be. The evidence was overwhelming. The pattern unmistakable. The damage undeniable. When they returned, the chair read the final decision with firm clarity. Karen would be removed from her committee position indefinitely. She would receive formal warnings for harassment, misuse of HOA processes, and falsified reports. She would also be responsible for reimbursing the owner for legal fees incurred during unnecessary code enforcement interventions. And, most importantly, the ESA designation would be fully recognized, protected under both state and federal guidelines. The room remained silent for several long seconds. Then a quiet murmur spread as attendees processed the decision. Some nodded in approval. Others looked stunned. Karen sat motionless, a rigid posture deflating as the realization settled in that her influence had evaporated in front of the entire neighborhood. As the hearing adjourned, the owner gathered his documents, not with triumph, but with a heavy, reflective calm. He hadn't wanted a battle. He hadn't wanted attention. All he had ever wanted was peace. Peace for himself, and peace for his dog. It was ironic, he thought, that this conclusion, which seemed so obvious now, had taken months of tension, countless hours of preparation, and the dismantling of someone's self-constructed power to reach. Outside the building, several neighbors approached him with nods of support. Some apologized for not stepping forward sooner. Others simply expressed relief that the ordeal was finally over. Their words, though simple, carried a sincerity that made the moment feel more meaningful than any official judgment. The conflict had separated the community, but the truth, once fully revealed, had begun stitching it back together again. Karen left without speaking to anyone. Her stride was hurried, her gaze locked on the ground. Her influence, once wielded recklessly, had dissolved. And the neighborhood seemed to exhale, as though relieved to be free from the weight of her constant scrutiny. The owner returned home that evening to find his dog waiting patiently by the gate, tail thumping with unrestrained joy. For the first time in months, the house felt like a sanctuary again. The stress, the pressure, the constant vigilance, it all lifted. The neighborhood was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the tense silence that preceded another complaint, but a peaceful stillness, the kind that comes when a storm has finally passed. He sat on the porch, stroking his dog's fur, watching the sun dip behind the roofs across the street. It wasn't just a victory. It was closure. And more importantly, it was the beginning of a new normal, one where his dog could roam the yard freely, one where he could enjoy his home without fear of fabricated accusations, and one where the community could move forward with a renewed sense of fairness. The story ended not with a grand spectacle, but with a quiet, restored peace. The kind of ending that seemed small from the outside, but for those living through it, meant everything.